So, I think we can all agree that Rainbow Six Siege is a pretty good-looking competitive shooter, with a relatively decent set of options in its graphics menu. And if you want to know what the best settings to use are, well, that depends how you play. So, I'm not going to tell you what to do, I'm just going to make sure that you're well informed enough to decide on your own. That being said, here is a list of every graphical setting that makes a visual difference, paired with the amount of FPS that you will gain by going from Ultra, or the most graphically demanding setting, to Low, or the lowest and least graphically demanding setting in that category, with all else being equal, of course. These are approximated based on averages on a 980 Ti. So if all you're interested in is FPS and gaining FPS, you can screenshot this and move along. However, you should know that there is some nuance here, and some things make more of a difference than others that probably shouldn't. And the keen among you will probably notice that one of these numbers stands out a lot. So this video is going to focus especially on multi-sample anti-aliasing, and specifically temporal filtering. And for good reason. Why is there an anti-aliasing setting that, when turned on, gives you better FPS? And why does it make such a massive difference? There's a lot of confusion, misinformation, dishonesty, and straight up ignorance around this topic. Quite literally every video I've seen on YouTube about Rainbow Six Siege graphic settings has been either misinformed, under-researched, or just intentionally vague about the subject of anti-aliasing. Even the good ones.
Anti-aliasing, just, do your thing. I don't really care about anti-aliasing.
So I just do temporal filtering. You can also set it to off as well. And so that's it. Those are my settings.
You'll want to be using temporal filtering. Massive. It's just too good. Too good. They're too good not to use. So
post-process anti-aliasing off. Do not ever use that. It's garbage. It looks like complete ass. I hate it. It's terrible. I don't like it with anti-aliasing off because it could look like too much like ass. So I keep temporal filtering to add just a very, very, very subtle smoothing of edges in the game. Or you could just go for off and it look like Counter-Strike 1.6. I mean, it's up to you. And really, that's it. So I hate it. It's terrible.
So yeah, I do want to clarify, I can't really fault anybody for not knowing what temporal filtering is, as the game doesn't tell you, and you actually have to close the game to read up and learn about what it actually is. The game's description says, temporal filtering combines multi-sample anti-aliasing with temporal reprojection of the previous frame. And the description used to be even more confusing. Special technique that renders the game using an MSAA alternating checkerboard pattern and temporally reprojects missing information from the previous frame to the current one to complete it. This provides a massive performance gain and reduce.
Are there any other uses for PANAS besides pee or sperms?
So yeah, that's just confusing. So let's go somewhere else and look for an answer for what this actually is. NVIDIA's website states that temporal filtering renders the game at half resolution with 2x MSAA. In other words, a 1920 by 1080 picture is rendered at 960 by 540, and 2x MSAA is applied to smooth out the now rougher edges. As a result, there are the same number of depth samples as the full resolution picture, but only a quarter of the shaded samples, improving performance but decreasing image quality. NVIDIA not only tells us that temporal filtering reduces image quality by using lower resolution images, but so does TAA, which you may remember is advertised in the game's menu as the highest quality option. And if you don't believe that temporal filtering and TAA will reduce your image quality noticeably, check this out. This is temporal filtering with FXAA, and this is temporal filtering with TAA. It looks like someone putting on and taking off their glasses for the first time, or someone smeared Vaseline all over the screen. And that's why NVIDIA says you shouldn't use these two settings together. I wonder why Ubisoft doesn't give us that information. So what about using temporal filtering on its own, without TAA? Let's have a look. I want you to guess which one of these is temporal filtering and which one of these is off. Now, I do want to clarify that my point in telling you this is not to bash temporal filtering. I'm sure it's a really cool technology, and for people with lower-end systems, it's really useful. The ability to render something in half resolution and upscale it without completely ruining the quality is impressive. So for people with lower-end systems, I definitely think that you should use it. However, it's not so clean-cut as temporal filtering will increase your performance, because that's not what I've found overall with my system. On the left is my benchmark for temporal filtering on, and on the right is temporal filtering off, everything else constant. For some reason, you could see that temporal filtering gives me lower minimums in some cases, as in bigger FPS drops, but almost always higher averages, by around 20 to 30 FPS. It seems like inside the building, I got bigger FPS drops using temporal filtering, but also higher maximums too, by a pretty significant amount. So long story short, I recommend using temporal filtering if you play competitively and want to squeeze every frame out of the game that you can, and I also recommend using it if you have a lower end system and have FPS FPS issues. Just know that it does definitely reduce the quality of your textures, and also for some reason it makes everything lighter. However, I don't recommend using TAA at all with any combination of settings, especially not if you're using temporal filtering, because it's the most demanding and it's the blurriest one. I recommend using FXAA or just off. Moving on, Ambient Occlusion or HBAO and SSBC are basically to add shadows and darkness into areas where there should be shadows and darkness. This is one of those things where I think it's personal preference, because I don't think it makes much of a difference in seeing players' visibility or competitiveness, but I do keep it off myself because of the extra few frames that it gives me. If you could say anything about its effect on competitive play, it might make drones harder to see in some situations. However, if you do want to turn it on, I recommend using HBAO rather than SSBC. Next up, lens effects. I just recommend turning this off to everyone. It's basically just bringing J.J. Abrams into your game, and lens flare and lights from basically any light source will look noticeably brighter, including the sun, so looking outside will also be brighter and harder to spot players when looking from inside to out. Also, this barely affects your frame rate at all, as I showed in the picture earlier. LOD quality is something a little different and hard to notice. As a matter of fact, on NVIDIA's website, it even says that the differences are imperceptible, both in screenshots and during gameplay. So, I mean, do whatever you want with this. I don't think it really makes a difference at all. Even at great distances, in every comparison, I don't see any difference, and this also barely affects your frame rate at all. Reflection quality is pretty self-explanatory. It's the quality of reflections both on floors and in liquids and other things like that. I keep this turned up because the difference is way too drastic, and I want the game to look good for YouTube videos and streaming and such. But if you don't care about that at all, you could gain about 10 frames or so by turning it low. Shading quality is pretty interesting and makes one of the biggest differences in FPS and in actual visual quality. It adds shading to certain textures to give them more depth, almost like tessellation. I keep this turned up because it looks really good for the same reason as reflections. Again, if you don't care really about how the game looks, you can turn this off, but one thing to note is that the difference in frames between high and medium is really big, but the difference between frames in low and medium is barely anything. Next up is shadow quality, and this one actually makes a pretty big difference between low, medium, and high, because when it's set on low, dynamic shadows are disabled and only static shadows will be shown. Here you can see the difference in quality between low and very high, and it's pretty drastic, so I keep this on very high. And as far as difference in frames, from medium to very high is not very much, so I recommend either using low or very high. Next up is texture filtering, and to be honest, I just don't see a difference at all. NVIDIA says that 16x affects the relief mapping on outdoor textures, which is another thing similar to tessellation, but I just don't see it. However, it could cost you up to 15 FPS, putting it on 16x depending on what your system is, so if you want to leave it on linear, go ahead. I doubt you'll notice a difference. And last but not last, because this list is way out of order, we have texture quality, the top of the list and the most important thing to change if you want to see a difference, which is pretty apparent here because you're looking at the difference between very high and low. When you're looking at low, it's basically just geometric shapes on certain textures, and very high it looks much better. The difference between very high and high, however, is much less noticeable and actually pretty imperceptible, so keep that in mind if you're tweaking your settings based on FPS. Big piece of advice here, if you have a lower capacity VRAM card, I recommend using only post-process anti-aliasing if you want to use very high or high texture graphics. Also, low to medium is by far the biggest jump in FPS difference. Zoom in, depth of field really doesn't make much of a difference at all. It's just preference and how it looks, really, in my opinion. You can see a difference of about 4 frames per second on average, and I leave it off for me just because I like the way the gun looks when you're zoomed in. And that's just about everything worth mentioning in my opinion when it comes to graphical quality and difference in FPS. NVIDIA's recommendations for anti-aliasing are here depending on what type of system you have, but I disagree with them, as you know, because I don't think you should use TAA, and I don't think you should use 4 times TXAA or MSAA or anything just because they affect your frame rate so much, and in a competitive game you want the best edge that you can possibly get in frame rate. Having done this research and knowing how temporal filtering and TAA both use reduced resolution images to render your picture, I'm curious to know which of these settings are used for consoles. I have a feeling that temporal filtering is definitely used because it reduces VRAM and gives a boost in frame rate, but as far as everything else, I'm really not sure. If anybody does know, you'll have to let me know in the comments because I couldn't find any information about this online. So, in summary, temporal filtering reduces image quality, but not by too much, and makes everything a little bit brighter. TAA reduces image quality quality and decreases your performance, so I don't recommend using that, despite what NVIDIA says. And for just about everything else, do whatever your preference tells you. Although I do recommend turning off lens flare, bloom, zoom in depth of field, and maybe ambient occlusion too, if you're playing competitively. I also recommend that you look at that picture that I made in the beginning that shows the FPS losses of each different setting, and now that you know what each of those things does specifically, you can look at it again and make a decision that's informed on which ones you want to turn up, which ones you want to turn down or off, and etc. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you learned something.
Well, you are a typical hunk who thinks you know everything about everything.